Welcome everyone to our second panel discussion where we're going to talk about the changes in China, both domestically as well as externally. And it is a great pleasure, of course, to have Professor Kishore with us again, and having just delivered, I think, a very interesting keynote address. I think one of the key takeaways, of course, is looking more optimistically and thinking about the future, what could bring out a good outcome, given that China and the US are so interdependent with each other, so big in the global economy, is for global countries to put pressure on them to come out with a stable outcome for all. So I think we can certainly discuss more on the external environment and what China's relationship with the US means, not just for China, but also I think with Asia. So we'll follow up more with Professor Kishore on that in a moment. I think what I would like to do at this stage is introduce Lu Hong. Lu Hong is head of China equities for Fullerton, and he's based in Shanghai, so he is on the ground. He has a good sense in terms of what's happening in China, obviously. And I think if we perhaps start our discussion and looking at the domestic changes in China, of course, what's got the headlines is we've seen this big paradigm shift, a big change in domestic policy in China. I'm wondering, Lu Hong, from your perspective, how should investors think about the changes going on in China domestically?
Oh, hi, Robert. I think the paradigm shift in China clearly is on the two focal point. First is the common prosperity. Second one is decarbonization. Yeah. So we believe China will probably going to have a much even distributions of wealth through the common prosperity initiatives.
Yeah, I guess an implication from that, of course, is that investors are going to have to kind of weigh up in their mind a bit of a trade-off, I guess, between getting economic fairness, but also growing the economic pie. And I guess what's maybe encouraging to investors, and is probably lying behind a relatively optimistic poll this year, people are quite confident that we'll get some rebound in China equities, is that China policymakers will still place significant importance on growing the economic pie, and I guess that's good for investors going forward. Perhaps if we step back from the structural changes in terms of the policy framework in China, of course, the other thing, Lu Hong, that has made the environment in China very difficult over the last sort of six to 9 months has been, of course, the very significant weakness in the property sector, and then we have seen quite a sharp slowdown in GDP growth. And I think people are thinking that this year China's authorities will be forced to do more policy stimulus. Do you see policy stimulus as being a potential game changer, and perhaps that could be one of the key driving forces behind the relatively optimistic view on the poll?
Not a game changer. We believe the Chinese government efforts in supporting investment, decarbonization, and green energy will be very essential tools to support growth for this year. But we don't think the market should be overly optimistic about the growth outlook in China. As you correctly pointed out, there are a lot of headwind risks in the property sector, in the consumption sector as well. So we remain cautiously optimistic on China this year.
Thank you, Lu Hong. Could be a good time for us to review our poll result. I think maybe we have the result on screen, if I'm not mistaken. But we can see that I think the majority expects China equities to be up by about 5 to 10% this year, which is a bit stronger than what we experienced last year. They were roughly flat. So I think that perhaps investors are cautiously optimistic, which is encouraging. Perhaps, Lu Hong, you could share with us where you see the key investment opportunities that Fullerton is most excited about in China.
Yeah, we are the most optimistic about the structural opportunities in China. So namely, for instance, green energy investment, some metaverse trend evolutions, as well as advanced manufacturing, including the themes of localizations. We think all these themes will be a long-term trend in which we can invest in and benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you, Lu Hong. Maybe we bring Professor Keyshaw back into the discussion. And I think one of the key things that I think that also Lu Hong has highlighted in terms of where some of the key trends and drivers have been playing out. And I think one of the things that's always top of the mind when investors think about the US-China relationship is not so much what it means for China, but as you alluded to in your keynote address, what does it mean for the rest of Asia? Are you relatively optimistic? I mean, I know there's kind of two schools of thought. Some people say if China suffers, then Asia suffers. But I wonder how you make a judgment, what the spillovers are to the rest of the region from this relationship between US and China.
Yeah. Well, I share the cautious optimism of Liu Hong and also the optimism of the poll results.
Yes.
Because I think when you look at China, the big danger is if you read the Anglo-Saxon media. And the Anglo-Saxon media, as you know, has been remarkably negative on the common prosperity drive that Liu Hong referred to. And they see it, frankly, as the end of the China growth story. That when China goes after Alibaba, Tencent, Didi, oh, that's over. The Chinese capitalism dream is over and China is going to reverse course. I don't buy that story. I actually think that the Chinese government actually has got very rational and sensible policymakers who are making a course correction, trying to ensure that China doesn't end up, as I said in my remarks, like the United States as a plutocracy where the big companies dominate, and instead create a more level playing field for everybody. And indeed, one of the major investors in China, Li Kai-fu, who's written a book on artificial intelligence, has said actually the crackdown on big tech in China is going to create opportunities for other companies to emerge, like the companies that he's invested in can grow and prosper. So that's, I think, one piece of good news on the common prosperity. But in terms of your question about the impact on the rest of the region, the paradox, I've spoken about one paradox in my remarks. The second paradox is that while this US-China contest will continue, and it could in some ways be dangerous for, let's say, for Southeast Asia, for the ASEAN countries, it could also bring benefits. And frankly, one reason why China has been courting Southeast Asia assiduously, is because it realizes that the United States may use Southeast Asia to contain China. To prevent that, China, as you know, proposed a free trade agreement 20 years ago. And as a result of which, China's trade with Southeast Asia, which used to be only 40 billion in the year 2000, one-third of the United States, which was 135 billion. Now, China's trade with Southeast Asia of 650 billion is more than double United States trade with ASEAN. And that's an indication of the benefits that flow to this region. And one thing that we should all pay attention to in January 2022 is that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's largest free trade agreement, just took off.
Yes, nice.
And that's going to be a free trade arrangement between China, Japan, and South Korea, three of the largest economies in this region. So you can see from the examples I give that there'll be some positive side benefits also from this US-China contest that we should pay attention to.
I think those are very valid points, and I think Lu Hong and Fullerton would agree with that. I know that we have placed a lot of importance on the growth in intra-regional trade because consumerism in China has been so important. And I also think your other point too is very critical to keep in mind that the Chinese policymakers are also going to put emphasis not just on the equality of growth with the common prosperity, but also wanting to grow the economic pie over time. And I think that is right, that it's important not to be too bearish about
on consumerism. Let me just add a very important statistic, just so that we understand how things have changed. In the year 2009, the size of China's retail goods market was $1.8 trillion, and United States was $4 trillion, more than double that of China's in 2009. You fast forward to 2019, 10 years later, and this is after 2 years of Trump's trade war against China. The United States retail goods market went from 4 trillion to 5.5 trillion, but China's retail goods market went from 1.8 trillion to 6 trillion, larger than the United States. So this is why no investor, no major multinational company can ignore the Chinese market. It's going to become the world's largest consumer market.
Understand. I think going back to your keynote address, and I think it was a very apt title of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I guess from an investor perspective, they're probably wondering how do they handicap these different outcomes. But I thought it was quite insightful from what you shared, and if I interpreted correctly, when it comes to the bad outcome, you actually see it more being a reflection of US internal politics and what happens on the US side rather than on the China side, which I thought was quite insightful and quite interesting. Is that a fair observation, that you think most of the downside risk comes from maybe the US side?
Well, I think the Chinese leaders, and I've been writing about this for 20 years, have been preparing for the day when the United States would try to either stop China's rise or contain China's rise. And that's why, frankly, they proposed a free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries 20 years ago in anticipation of this. So the Chinese advantage in the US-China geopolitical game is that the Chinese have a rational, systematic, long-term strategy for managing the United States. And the United States, sadly, doesn't have a strategy. And as you know, in my book, Has China Won?, I describe a one-on-one lunch I had with Henry Kissinger. And it was Henry Kissinger who told me at the one-on-one lunch that the United States doesn't have a strategy. And even to today, it doesn't have a strategy. And I, as a friend of the United States, I'm saying to them, why don't you work out what your long-term goals are? China is clear about where it is heading. The United States is not clear about where it is heading in this contest. Sadly.
Understand. And you made the point about, the potential return of Donald Trump, but I guess from the Democrat side, do you see, I don't know, new leaders coming through there who may be more sort of pro-China, or how do you judge the political state on the other side of the fence?
There will never be any pro-China leader in the United States, but there may be a more rational, calm leader who could try to adopt a more careful long-term strategy. And frankly, President Joe Biden, by the way, actually has a very good personal relationship with President Xi Jinping. And unfortunately, President Joe Biden, for domestic political reasons, cannot show that he's a good friend of Xi Jinping. But they have spent so much time with each other. And even before President Xi became the president of China, he visited the United States, and Joe Biden was his host.
Right.
And there was a certain personal bonding between the two. So that is actually one factor that may also try and keep the situation relatively calm. But I think hopefully in 2024, as you suggested, if there can be newer, younger leaders without the baggage of the past who take a fresh approach, that's possible, but none will be pro-China. The only question is whether or not they can be just rational on China.
Right. Well, that's good. No, well, thank you very much, Professor Keyshaw, for sharing your views on that. I think that, and also thank you to Lu Hong for giving us the domestic China perspective. I think a lot of interesting takeaways there for our listeners. I guess the key thing is that our poll results do show conservative optimism on China equities this year, and that is echoed by Lu Hong. And I guess from the more structural external relationship perspective, we have kind of three scenarios to think about. And I guess the key signpost for the bad outcome is to keep an eye on US domestic politics. So thank you. Thanks very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lu Hong.
Good to be here.
Thanks all. Thank you.